Well, a very good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are tuning in from. My name is Adrian Reed, and a very warm welcome to this BA Community webinar. Now, today we're going to be talking about a topic that is perhaps a little different from some of the other topics that we've covered so far. We're always talking about professional BA development, but it can be hard sometimes to think about how to fit that in. And particularly if perhaps budget is, is a little bit sparse and you're searching around for ideas to develop. Perhaps you're even looking to get a slightly broader view on business analysis and sort of life in general. Well, it'll be no surprise that reading can really help with that. But reading can be quite hard to do when there's so many other things going on, and it can really, really help to have a bit of an incentive to read. And so I'm really pleased today we're joined by, friend and ex-colleague of mine, Sara Heaven. Sara and I worked together for a large financial services company some time ago. And I mean, Sara, you've got a fantastic CV spanning all sorts of industries, from telecommunications to financial services to healthcare and everything in between, in all sorts of business analysis and program management roles. But although all of that is true, you also have a master's degree from Oxford, which is a fantastic achievement. The thing I will probably always remember you for is being instrumental in starting a book club at an organisation we both worked for. And I remember that how much I got from that, and how much the sort of small core of people that really stuck with it really got from it as well. So thank you very much for sort of coming on and having a chat today, Sara.
You're welcome, Adrian. You're welcome. And it's gone on from that first book club to actually I've just set up the fourth one of those book clubs at the organisation I'm at now. So it's been a repeating pattern of behaviour from me over the last, I'd say, 12 years.
A pathological book club setter up. Fantastic. So excellent. So just before we get started, for those of you that are attending live, a couple of things to mention. One is you will see a Q&A button at the very bottom of your screen. We would very, very much welcome your questions throughout this session. So this is largely a sort of, it's an informal chat. So please do add your questions as they occur to you. If as we're talking you have particularly good books to recommend, then please post those in the Q&A as well, and we'll read them out. Also, for those of you that haven't been on a session before, in the webinar chat, a little pop-up will have just appeared with a link to a Google Jamboard. Now, I'll just share my screen very, very briefly, because if you've not seen Jamboard before, it's pretty intuitive. It's a collective, it's like a shared whiteboard. But what you can do, as we're talking along, it would be great if when you hear a point that's particularly relevant for you, you sort of note the point down and put whatever. You can choose the colour that you want and move it around, and we'll see what's on there. And this is a great way of sort of collectively note-taking. So by the end of the webinar, we'll have a really interesting record of the sorts of things that were discussed. The only thing I'd ask is please don't put questions on there, because I'm not able to look at that screen and keep an eye on that as well. So keep the questions in the Q&A panel. That would be fantastic. Great. Okay. So Sara, book clubs, interesting topic. The first question that springs to my mind is what initially inspired you to create your first book club?
Well, I was at the organisation we were working at, Adrian. We were setting up a business architecture practice at the time, and I attended a webinar, actually, an analyst webinar, where they were talking about kind of what types of things you should do if you're setting up a business architecture practice. And the analyst said, well, actually, the most important thing you can encourage any budding business architects to do is to read. And when you think about it, it's just obvious, isn't it, that actually just broadening your perspectives and reading as widely as possible is just an obvious thing for anybody to do, really, because I think in a business architecture role and a business analyst role, in fact in many roles in organizations, having a kind of broad spectrum of things, models and perspectives to draw on is just so valuable in any kind of conversation, and also in just helping you to analyze situations and problem solve. And so I thought, well, this is just obvious, but it just occurred to me that I hadn't heard of anyone having a business book club. And we hear all the time about non-fictions. In fact, groups of people in my social group were all in fiction book clubs. And I thought, well, actually, why don't we have a professional business club, book club, that we meet on a regular basis? And it just gives a bit of a framework. And I think there's nothing like kind of cadence and having to have a meeting that you're going to kind of a little bit of peer pressure to encourage them actually get on and do it. I mean, you can all read books individually, and lots of people do that, of course, but there's something nice about having a discipline around it and a cadence around it, and also that kind of peer discussion, being able to discuss whether you like the book or didn't like the book and what you got out of it. And so I floated the idea. We had quite a big analyst team at that organisation, so I floated the idea, and a few people said, sounds okay, sounds interesting. So I thought, well, let's give it a go. So that was what inspired it, Adrian.
No, and I mean, I still remember the kickoff meeting when we were working together and was that your first book club when you and I were working together?
That's right. It was my first one. Yeah, when you and I were working together. So since then, I've done it on three other occasions, and I've kind of missed it. There's been gaps where I haven't been in a book club, where I've been doing other things, and I felt like, I can't commit to reading a book every month because I'm too busy doing other things. But actually, when I've got the space to do it, I really value it, because I get so much from it.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, I don't know if you'd agree with this, Sarah, but what I found is definitely from the development perspective, I mean, I've gained a huge amount. It's got me into healthy habits of reading. I like to read more now because of that sort of book club. It provides that incentive, but also I probably read things I never would have read otherwise, because there were things I wouldn't necessarily have chosen. But I mean, I know when you and I worked together, we sort of did it in a semi-democratic way, where everyone could suggest something, but then we voted. And I can remember there being topics that but you sort of, and I think that do you think that's important for us to actually sort of get out of our comfort zone a bit and choose some stuff that isn't what we would normally choose?
I think so, because you never know what you're going to come across and what you're going to discover doing it that way. I think the idea of making it as egalitarian as possible is a good one. So I don't think it would be a good idea for the person starting up the book club to say, right, this is what we're going to read, this is the schedule of things we're going to read, because I don't think that would really encourage participation. But I do think I've certainly read a lot of things that I wouldn't naturally have read. And I think we were discussing one of the books, which I've said, I remember that book because I really didn't like it. I really didn't get on with it. But that's part of the process, I think, and actually having the discussion about, well, what did you get out of this book you thought was so amazing, and what did I think was so terrible? I think actually having a point of view on it, because just because you're reading something doesn't mean you have to agree with it. In fact, that's part of the joy, is being able to have that debate around, what's your point of view?
Yeah, and in fact, the book, just because it's literally here, the book we were discussing, which I quite liked. I thought it was quite wordy, but it's Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, and I think this was probably like the second or third book we read. And I still remember, Sarah, the first book we read was Good to Great by Jim Collins.
Yeah.
And I still find myself using phrases from that all the time, because there was the idea of the flywheel of growth, and there was and doom loops. Now actually, because I'm sort of into my systems thinking, I see those as reinforcing and reinforcing feedback loops and or causal loops. But it's interesting, isn't it, how things stick? I mean, that must have been, what, 10 years ago? I don't know, long.
It was about 12 years ago, actually. I was thinking about this. It must have been about 12 years ago that we first set that first one up.
Yeah.
It's that, and I think Good to Great it's kind of lost favour a little bit, I think, in terms of people don't refer to it. At the time, if you remember, at the time we read it, somebody here in the organisation was heavily promoting that book and saying, oh, it's a must-read book. And so we all thought, well, this is probably quite good for us to understand the language. But I think, as you said, I think it was something that generated a lot of discussion, and a lot of the concepts, I found myself referring back to them and thinking them through, particularly in that book around the kind of maintaining legacy. That's something that stuck with me over the years.
Yeah. And it's interesting, again, because I'd forgotten about that, Sarah. I'd forgotten that's the reason we read Good to Great. But that again, one of the things as business analysts that certainly I've heard myself griping on about from time to time is, oh, well, we don't get recognition. The exec don't know we exist. Well, actually, if we start to read what the exec read to speak in the same language, that can only be a good thing. If we use the same tools, if we create that or cultivate that shared language, invite ourselves into their world almost.
Absolutely. And I've found each time that I've set a book club up in an organisation, it's not only the shared language or understanding, having models that you can reference with senior stakeholders is important. That was the reason for kind of setting up in the first place. But language between the members of the group changes, because as a group, you then have shared references to talk, to discuss, and you can discuss how actually this scenario, this model would apply, or that concept would apply or not apply. But you've got that kind of shared language then, that everybody who's in that group has got the same level of, they understand this, they take the same meaning out of it.
Yeah. Fantastic. So lots of reasons that we could and should set up a business book club. A question I'm sure people listening in have is how, and not just the mechanics of how, but how to keep people going, because people get busy. It's really easy to put personal development and professional development on the back burner. So how have you got it started, and how have you kept people coming along?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to get really clear on quite a simple, basic premise for it. And it should be very simple concept. But actually, it surprised me that sometimes people, when I've said, oh, we're going to set up a book club, people have actually interpreted that in different ways and thought, well, everybody's going to read a different book, or we're all going to read a summary of a book, and that way we can get through a lot of books. I've been like, well, no, because I don't really think, for me, a lot of the benefit is in the discussion and the shared experience. So I think just get really clear on the very simple, basic premise, which is you're going to collectively decide that you're going to read a book. The book needs to be somehow loosely connected with business or organisations. You're not going to read novels particularly. You might read a biography, that might be relevant, a business biography, or even somebody, an interesting character's biography. I think we actually read Barack Obama's book, didn't we? I think we might have done that, read his biography, or maybe I just didn't. But so you're going to choose a book. You're going to all read that book, and then you're going to meet over a set period of time. Usually, it's in my view, about a month, because that gives people long enough to have read the book or listened to the book, and then it's not so long that everyone will have forgotten about what was actually in the book. So, and then you're all going to meet and have a bit of a structured discussion about the book, and then choose the next one. And that's simple as it is. It just needs to be super simple and super easy, I think.
Yeah, and one thing you mentioned there, Sarah, is one thing I certainly remember we did when we were sort of involved in a book club, was actually make sure it's one that is available on like in a physical format or Kindle or whatever, but also audiobook. Because means that people who prefer to listen to audiobooks, or people who have long commutes or whatever, are able to participate as well. So you mentioned the structure, us having a simple structure. So what would a book club agenda look like? What would the process be?
Oh, okay. So I think typically the meeting would start off with an explanation of, just a reminder of what we're doing very simply. In my view, what I tend to do is go into quite a simple structured discussion around things like a key summary of the points of the book. I wouldn't go overboard on that. I have had some experience where people have really gone to town on the summary of the book. And actually, I've been in a situation where people have actually created games for the participants of the book club to then participate in, to kind of play out some of the scenarios, which has been fantastic. But it then also sets quite a high bar for everybody else to then follow. So it's great to be experiencing that someone else is going to put the time in. But it's nice to share the responsibility around the book club members. Yeah. And it doesn't. Wouldn't want it to be so high that it kind of puts people off joining because they feel that they've got to put a lot of work into the analysis. But I think a summary of the key takeouts, and then I think really having a structured discussion around what did everybody get out of the book? What were your key takeouts? What did you like? What did you dislike? What did you agree? What did you disagree with? So some very simple structured points like that, not overdoing the analysis at all, but just really trying to get out of people what they felt about it.
Yeah, and I think the point you made there, I think the point you made there, Sarah, about sharing the facilitation responsibility is a really important one from an egalitarian perspective, but also just from a logistical perspective. In that, there's if it's every month, that's quite a lot to be for one person to take on. So we've got a question from Stephanie. And Stephanie asks, do you only do a discussion after the entire book is read, or do you ever do multiple discussions as you read portions of the book? Oh, that's a really interesting thought.
Ooh, I've never done the portion part because I'm always very keen for some people to actually to allow people the chance to finish the book. And what I've also experienced is that some people in some groups, they share the books around. That's happened quite a few times where one person has decided to buy the book and then 1 month and then share it so that actually a couple of people could read it. So I've never experienced the kind of portion book. I have experienced people not reading the whole book but reading a summary. And I'd say I wouldn't be kind of sniffy about that at all. If people haven't had time to read the book and they want to come along and they've read the summary, then I'd always encourage them to come along and participate in the discussion rather than sort of saying, well, you've had to have read the whole thing, because I still think they can get something out of it and you can get something out of their participation. So no, it's a good question, not something I've thought through. What do you think, Adrian?
Oh no, it's interesting. At the minute I saw that question from Stephanie, I was thinking, oh, that's really interesting, because you could almost have, if you've got a group electronic forum, whether that's some SharePoint site or whatever, or you could almost have a asynchronous exchange of ideas as you read them. Like oh, I've got up to chapter 4 and I'm thinking this, and then you could drag that into the meeting itself. So I think that's really interesting.
It's a good idea. Yeah, good idea. I mean, the book club that I'm running at the moment, we have got a team site where we just kind of maintaining information about upcoming books and ideas that people have. So we could actually do that quite easily. We could do it. Yeah, it would also be kind of. I'm never sure when I get to the book club how many people have actually read it. Yeah. I'm not really sure. I guess it would be you'd kind of expose that a little bit if people were giving you running updates in between meetings. Yeah. I'm always just pleased that people come along to the second meeting and are interested enough to discuss it.
Yeah, on that note, Sarah, how do you keep people coming? Because let's face it, project and program and any kind of change work is demanding. How do you keep people coming along?
Well, I think my advice to anybody setting up a book club is not to be not to set high expectations around how many people actually will stick with it. I think you get a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, it's a great idea, great idea. Really, I read loads. I'd love to be part of it. And then in the 4 times I've done it, it does kind of come down to a core group of people who it works for, and really value that kind of cadence. So I would set an expectation in yourself. Obviously, set the ambition high, but have an expectation that people may not actually do what they say. I think in terms of then making it, trying to maximize the number of people who do join, I think making it as open as possible. So these days, in fact, the last few book clubs have been with VC. So now it's all on VC, so that anyone in the whole, if you've got people who are distributed, they can join in, and then they're not disadvantaged by not being in maybe the sort of physical hub. So make sure that's the case. I would also make the book choice democratic. So as the book club organizer, it's quite tempting to think, well, I want to read these things. Yes. I wouldn't recommend that. I'd recommend that you make it a democratic process, although I would suggest that you start off the club with something that's actually you think is going to be a bit of a crowd pleaser, just to get people started, not something too heavy going. You said we started the one that we were in with Good to Great.
Yes.
A couple have started with Our Iceberg is Melting. It's the fairy tale. It's a tale, isn't it? It's a tale of John Cotter's work that's produced by another author. And it's a very thin book, and it's kind of quite hard to argue that anyone would. And the letters are quite big, and there's pictures, so it's quite hard to argue that it's a book that's going to be difficult for anybody to get through in a month. So that's also good tip, I think.
Definitely, and I think I mean, if I recall correctly, that like the kickoff meeting had, I don't know if the kickoff meeting was like 100%. Then by the first meeting, we were at about 80%. And then a few months later, we were probably at about 20%, with 10% that dropped in and out. But actually, the core, I thought that it's interesting. There was a really consistent core of people that got to know each other really well. I mean, so that leads us on to another point. Actually, before we go there, let's take another couple of questions. So Nancy asks, actually this is a really interesting question. Do you ever review articles or a series of articles based on a topic?
No, I haven't actually ever done that, Nancy. Mainly because there's been so many books to get through. So I think it has been suggested. Around doing that, but actually we've never actually got to the point of choosing a topic like that, because there's just so many books that are really good candidates to read that we haven't done that. But I think that's a good idea. I mean, I think journal articles are great, actually, and actually if you wanted to get really deeply into a topic and understand what the research is saying, it might be that actually maybe you read a book like we were talking about Good to Great. It might be specific topics that actually as a group you want to go deeper into, and then read journal articles around those. That could be really interesting. So I think it's a great idea. I think you just want to see where the group would take you, in terms of what is interesting to the group.
That is interesting, isn't it? Because you could I mean, I suppose it becomes a question of purpose, but you could imagine it morphing into, almost a book one month, then almost a mini research topic the next month, where everyone brings their findings on a particular topic, and almost like pooling our collective professional development somehow.
Yeah, you could do that. You could do it like that. I would say I think it's good if your aim is to try and include as many people, though, is to try and keep it as open and accessible. Because the one danger in doing that would be it might feel a little bit exclusive, and then people who that floating 10% who might drop in and out. I always make sure that actually I use as many channels as possible to let the organisation know what we're reading, and that actually please join, the more the merrier. I think I think if you're setting a club up in one area of an organisation, my personal view is it's nice to make it as open as possible, just because of that dynamic around people will drop out. So why not include other areas? Because it helps break down silos and it helps to build relationships across the business. So
yeah, but breaking down silos personally, and if they're suggesting books to read, then again it broadens our horizons as practitioners. So that's a really nice idea. So our next question is from Jason. Jason asks, are there any distinct outputs after reading a book? For example, do they go into a recommended book to read list, or rate the books to compare against each other? So are there any sort of deliverables?
Well, there will be deliverables in terms of, like, I think what you've just done with the Jamboard is good. I mean, that would be a really good tool actually to use in a book club, because you'd have then your own synopsis and thoughts about that book. I can't remember whether when that first book club, whether we actually rated the books. I can't remember whether we did.
I don't think so.
No, I haven't done that actually. I haven't done any kind of formal rating. It's been more around, well, actually the discussion and what do we get out of it, and then any notes that have been taken around, the summary of it and people's conclusions. So it's quite nice to maintain that summary view. You can look back on that. The main output, I would say, is your own knowledge. It's actually putting information into your collective heads, and then being able to draw on that in future discussions and future situations. That's the main output. Absolutely.
And I really like the idea of summaries that you mentioned there, Sarah. And I'm imagining that, if it's a BA team, you could almost have those as mini crib references. Like it becomes a bit of a knowledge artifact for the team as well, which then hopefully draws people into the book club. So, yeah. Okay, so just before I want to move on and talk about other unexpected benefits of a book club. And I'm just going to, before we do that though, I'm just going to share my screen, and I'm going to see what people have put on the Jamboard, which is always the terrifying part of the webinar. I have no idea what people will be writing. If you are tuned in live and you arrived a little bit late, I'm going to put the URL to the Jamboard in the chat again here. So if you did arrive a little late, you can still participate. So let me share my screen 1 second. Share, come on, share. There we go. Okay, so we have quite a lot of thoughts on here. So start with a crowd pleaser, then be democratic. We have provides access to a great variety of concepts, great for development. Use video conferencing. Thinking in bets, that's a good one. Keep it accessible. Reading is obvious if you want to broaden your horizon. Actually read it. Yeah, so actually people are picking up there's a lot of, and try not to have high expectations. I think that was a key point as well. So lots of good stuff on the collective note taking here. So fantastic. Okay. So if you are attending live, keep them coming, because this will be a useful record of the conversation for anyone who's not here. So
a tool to use, wouldn't it, actually, in a book club scenario. It would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are watching this and are wondering about the tool, it is a free Google tool. So if you've got a Google account, you can just use it if you go to jamboard.google.com. Okay, so Sarah, I want to move on and talk about unexpected benefits of.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll start by saying I found the camaraderie and the networking to actually be something that was hugely beneficial. I mean, probably the reason we're still, we may well have still been talking now 12 years later or whatever, but we'll probably know each other better through that book club.
Yeah.
What other advantages were there?
Well, I think it gives you something interesting to say in job interviews.
Oh, wow. Yeah, good point.
Advantage in that when you get that question around, well, what have you kind of done that's above and beyond your call of duty, that might be a bit one of those kind of questions around that kind of thing, or what have you done that's creative in your work? it's a good thing to be able to say, well, actually, I set up a business book club for the whole of my BA community, and this is what we did. And actually, it shows two things. It shows that you can, you can take the initiative, that you're doing something that's a little bit out of the ordinary, but it also shows you're taking ownership for your own professional development, but being quite collaborative with that, in that you're also taking other people along with you. So I think it's a really good thing to be able to say, and obviously that's not a reason for doing it, but it is quite an interesting byproduct of setting up a book club. I think also we talked earlier about the shared language between members. I think that's a really important part, actually, and that's the reason why I set the one that we were in up in the first place, was so that we had different frames of reference and we could talk about things. And that's actually why we read Good to Great to start with, so we could actually have those conversations with those senior stakeholders and we're talking the same language. And I think talked about that group, the initial group getting smaller. It's not really a negative thing. It's just, that's just how things happen. People lose their enthusiasm over a period of time. But if I look at that kind of group and in all the book clubs that I've done, and the shared language that we've developed and the ability to communicate because we're talking about similar concepts, it doesn't mean to say we always have to agree with each other, but we've got kind of a shared understanding of the concepts, and the ability to debate. That safe space to practice and debate is just a really useful thing to practice, I think. And so being able to do that in a safe space when you're talking about somebody else's material and not your own precious analysis or report that you've just produced, but you're debating about somebody else's, is a really useful skill to hone, I think. So I think those are some of the benefits. I also think that I've noticed that it is the people who stick with the book club who take their development really seriously. And if I look back, I think you could kind of trace a pattern to people who've then gone on to do quite interesting things, maybe taken a risk with their careers or gone for a job that's a bit different to what you might have expected. And I don't know that I'm not calling any particular correlation there, but it is something that I've noted, and I guess it wouldn't be that far a leap to think, if you are, you're interested and you're curious and you're taking your development really seriously, that would happen.
Yeah, I sort of thought the same, Sarah, when I was thinking back to the people that were the core members of the book club we were a part of, and I was thinking, oh, actually everyone's doing quite different but really interesting things in my view. And it's interesting what you said about professional development and having stuff to talk about in job interviews, because the last webinar I ran last week was about bouncing back from redundancy. Because obviously, well, unfortunately at the moment, I look on LinkedIn and I see lots of very, very good people through no fault of their own are redundant. And one thing one of the speakers on that webinar said, she said when she's recruiting for BAs, yes, of course, certification might come into it, but she said actually she would look favourably at somebody who had, if you've got regular professional development, she would consider that better than a certificate you did 10 years ago to tick a box type of thing.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to think actually all of these things are, of course, that's not the reason we should do it, but it's another fringe benefit of the, the activity.
I agree. I mean, I've interviewed quite a lot of people, and I always find it. I usually ask a question about how are you developing yourself, and if I get the answer, which is I'm happy to go on a course.
Yeah.
I find that quite a kind of not a positive response, really. The idea of someone taking responsibility and realizing that their development's in their own hands is a really positive message. So being either part of a book club or starting a book club, I think really helps you to have a conversation about that, because then it also sparks, well, what have you read?
Yeah.
What have you read? What did you find interesting? What do you not find interesting? It sparks a whole new kind of thread of conversation.
It does. It does. That brings us to a question that Hertja has asked. So Hertja says, "Hi, Adrian and Sarah. Are there any pitfalls that's in relation to starting book clubs that we should avoid?" So we've talked about the benefits, but what about the pitfalls?
Good question. I think you should check. You should check with your the context that I'm talking about. The book clubs is if you're working in an organisation, maybe you're a part of a team, and you set up the club as part of that team. That's the context that I've always done it. It's not to say it's the only context you could use, but that's the context. And in that context, you should check with the organisation and your manager that they're comfortable that you do that. And it's not a surprise. I haven't encountered a situation where there's been any discomfort with it, because every organisation I've worked for has been more than happy to support personal development of their employees. So I've never encountered any issue. I have kind of encouraged maybe to have the meetings at lunchtime, if that's been if people have been concerned, if maybe a manager was concerned about time being taken out of the day. And that also, I haven't encouraged people to sit during the day reading the book. It's deemed to be an extracurricular activity, not an activity that actually it gives you an excuse to just sit and read a book for a month and not do any work. So so be cautious about that. But I would just check in that they're comfortable that you do that, and the terms in which you're doing it. So I've also every organisation, I've never been in a book club where we've asked the organisation to buy the books. It's always been the individuals. That's a common question that people ask: is the company going to buy the book for me? And no, it's about your personal development. It's voluntary, and so it shouldn't really be an expectation that suddenly the organisation is going to start funding. I mean, if they do, fantastic, but I've never set any expectation like that.
Yeah, I actually think that's interesting, Sarah, because that question had never crossed my mind. And I'm just mulling on it, I'm reflecting on it now, and I'm wondering that if the organisation did fund it, that would probably change who would attend. But I'm not sure. I mean, I suppose there's an element that it might make the club more accessible, which is a good thing. But £10 a month for a book, if you're a professional in a sort of business analysis role, is probably normally, it's a few coffees, isn't it? It's the cost of a few coffees in the canteen.
Yeah.
So I wonder actually whether if the organisation funded it, that might even be counterproductive, because if you have to fund it yourself, you've got more for one. I know it's a horrible expression, but you've got more skin in the game.
Yeah, and you've got more freedom as well. I think if the organisation was funding it, there would be it would feel a bit more like the manager of the area might have to say what the book is going to be, rather than it being a real democratic process of those who want to participate. So I don't think I would particularly like it if the organisation was funding it.
Yeah, it's
strange. I haven't really thought about it in that context before, actually. But
it's interesting, because just as we were talking, I was thinking about an audiobook that I really enjoyed, and it was one of those. We were talking beforehand about when the author narrates it. I really like that as well, when the author narrates it. And it was Steve Martin's autobiography called Born Standing Up, which is narrated by Steve Martin, which is, what more could you really ask for, right? And I got a lot from that. Do I aspire to be a stand-up comic? Jury's out on that one. I think I've got at least one stand-up act in me, but that's a whole nother conversation. We've got the time. But I got a lot from that, but I can't imagine most managers going, well, okay, I'm going to buy 30 copies of a stand-up comics autobiography. So it gives you that freedom to be more diverse, perhaps. So
yeah, I think it does. Although I never really thought that through, but I think it would if the organisation was. I feel like you'd need to check in that you've got the right book, and does it then have a direct benefit to the organisation? Does it directly relate to the work that you're doing? I think one of the pleasures of it is that actually just read widely in things that you're interested in, that enough of you're interested in that you'll read it. And it can be a bit tangential, but it's surprising how useful that still is, even though it might be not directly related to your specific industry or your specific discipline. You're still going to get benefit from it.
Well, that's it, isn't it? I know our job title is, or the job title is business analyst, but actually there's an argument that says actually we're business synthesists. We don't just analyze, we bring things together. And actually, sometimes I find I read a book that's completely unrelated to analysis, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's a different context, but I can take this bit of it and bring it into our world, and that changes that technique slightly, and it somehow makes it more useful in a context. So, okay, so let's take another question. So we have a question from Marcus, and Marcus asks, is there a particular length of pages which you have a limit on for each book?
Good question, Marcus. No, not really. Not really. I have had a few suggestions recently for quite complex technical books, and I although it's a democratic process, I have kind of steered people away from that a little bit, because I think that I just would prefer to be open and accessible rather than kind of going down to a niche area and reducing the attractiveness of the book. That said, if everybody wanted to do that, then that would be fine by me, and I'd read it as well. So no, not really. I think a lot of business books are kind of around 2 to 300 pages anyway, but I've never set any particular limit on it. It's just really what's been of interest. As I mentioned, I have read that's on a few of the book clubs started off with that book, Our Iceberg is Melting, which is actually really, really short. So no, I haven't. How about you, Adrian? Have you ever?
No, I was just thinking about that, and I was thinking, I think it tends to be a bit self-regulating, because if someone suggests something that's 700 pages long, people tend to say, whoa, I'm not going to have time for that. So I think it's one of those things where the group sort of finds a norm, doesn't it? And I think if you think about like the audio versions, often the audio versions are between about 7 and 8 hours. That sort of feels about right for most people for a month, and that I think translates to about 300 or 250 pages or whatever. So, okay, so a question I'm sure people have is, what books would you recommend? And I know you had a few, and I think you put a slide together for this.
Yeah, I did. Well, I did put a slide together. It's quite difficult, as I mentioned earlier. It's quite difficult to contain the number of books, actually. So I have put a slide together, and I've included a few books that are on the book club that I'm currently running. They're on our list, so they're available. We've either just read them, or that they're available for people to choose. So let's see if I can just share. Oh, something's going a bit wrong here, Adrian. One moment.
No problem. I'll fill while you're sorting out.
Is it going now?
It's just loading. Yeah.
Okay. So these are just a few of the books that are on our current list, and the first one we actually read last month, Factfulness, Hans Rosling. It's a brilliant read, actually. Brilliant read. And you can see on here that I've included on the list whether they're audiobooks. We have got some books on our long list that aren't audiobooks, but I always include whether it is an audiobook, because it is important. Now, personally, I have a commute when we're not in lockdown. I have a commute, and so actually being able to have the book in audio form is really useful for me, and I find it very useful actually for kind of doing things like if I'm gardening or something or cleaning, to actually be able to listen to the book at the same time is quite a useful exercise for me. So I include that in the list. But the Hans Rosling book is a book that actually lends itself to reading, because it's got loads of visualizations of facts actually in it. So if you do read it as an audiobook, there is a PDF and you can access all the material online as well. But it is a book that actually lends itself to having the physical book, because you can then see all the nice visualizations. Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman. Adrian and I were talking about Daniel Kahneman earlier, because he's popping up, I think, Adrian, in lots of other books that you're reading at the moment. Yeah. His name.
Yeah. And you know, and the type 1 and type 2 thinking just appears to have sort of got in the business lexicon, you know, so it's...
Yeah. And I mean, that's a classic book that you see referred to by many other authors, and it's grounded in psychological theory. And I think Daniel Kahneman actually won the Nobel Prize for his, not necessarily for this book, but as for the thinking that went into this book. So it's a really good one. The next one, The $1 Trillion Coach. I haven't actually read this book yet, but I'm hoping that my book club are going to choose it, because I quite like to read it. Because I think it'd be quite interesting, because this is actually based, I think it might be a bit of an update from Good to Great, because he talks about, you know, what's happened in these companies, Google, Apple. How have they worked? What's been made them successful? What's made their leaders successful? So I'm quite interested in actually reading that. I haven't read that myself. I've included the Story Factor. Now, I think we read a book when we were in a book club together, which was about storytelling and mental models. And there are a lot of books along this theme around how the importance of storytelling and how you go about telling stories. And this is one example of that from Annette Simmons. And I think that's a really useful skill for the analyst community to have, is the idea of being able to explain a problem or explain a situation through storytelling. So I think anything on that area is great. And I mean, no explanation needed for the analyst community about start with why, really.
Absolutely.
But I think what you might find is, although that's an obvious question for the analyst community, you know, a book like this from Simon Sinek might then give you references that you could use with your senior stakeholders, because they may have read this book or listened to this book, and so actually picking up the same language can be a useful thing.
Fantastic.
So they're just a few suggestions. Yeah. It's hard to limit it, really.
It is. I mean, there are so many good books and audiobooks out there. I mean, what I'd say is, if you're listening in live and there's a book that you've read or listened to that you've particularly found useful recently, put it in the Q&A and we'll read it out so others can, or put it on the Jamboard, or do both so we can share it. So our next question, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. It's not a name I'm familiar with. I think it's Chinier or Chinieri. Chinier asks, are there books that are out of bounds in your book clubs?
Oh, well, I actually, when setting up the book club that I'm in now, I had to just deal with the question about, are we going to read novels? And I said, no, we're not going to read novels. We're going to read books that are in some way related to the organisation. So that gives you a broad spectrum. I don't, unless there was some major takeout to be had from a novel, which was like a moral tale, or I don't know, something. And actually, some business books are now written in story form, so I think that's fine. Yes. But I think it has to be.
Do you remember The Goal by L.I. Gold we read?
I'd forgotten that, actually. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes, we did. I'd completely forgotten that. That's amazing. Yeah. So apart from that, I would say no. I'd say be guided by the group. See what the kind of group wants to do. I think biographies are fine. Actually, I think I've been we've read Steve Jobs' biography once. And that was useful and interesting. But I'd say to kind of steer away from out and out novels, because then you're kind of overlapping into a fiction book club. And I think then the kind of ability to reference that with your stakeholders and get organizational takeouts is going to be pretty limited.
Yeah, I agree, and I think biographies are interesting. I went through a phase of reading a lot of biographies outside of the book club, and I went on so Dragon's Den, or if you happen to be tuning in from the US, I think it's called Shark Tank over there. But
Really?
Yeah, I read a lot of the dragons or the sharks autobiographies, and it was really interesting. And two that really struck me as particularly interesting were Duncan Bannatyne's and Deborah Meaden's. You start to understand the person more when you understand sort of what their background is, and you sort of learn that Duncan Bannatyne started by selling ice creams with an ice cream van. And then moved into owning care homes, and and these sorts of things. It just you sort of in a way.
I agree, and I think it can make you might think, well, what's the linkage with professional development if you do that kind of thing? But it can be around the things like the importance of perseverance, the ability to cope with change, ability to cope with ambiguity. What do you do when something fails? How do you pick yourself up again? All of those sorts of things are equally important in terms of your own personal development. Being able to call on those resources is really useful. And often if you've read, I've just read, not as part of the book club, but I've read Michelle Obama's book, and I just found that really great because she's just so open about her experiences and how she felt about it in this kind of time, which must have been, it's how many people experience what she's experienced, but she's just so open about how unsure she was and how she felt about things at the time, and it's just makes the experience feel very accessible.
Absolutely. So we've got recommendations starting to pour in the Q&A.
Oh.
We've got recommendations. So Lee recommends Switch by Chip and Dan Heath. That's good.
We read that, didn't we? I think we read that one.
No, we read another one by Chip and Dan Heath. Which was, I can't remember. It was about behavioural economics, I think, but I can't remember the title of it. Leadership by Alex Ferguson.
Good.
Legacy by James Kerr. Mercy recommends A Ride of a Lifetime by Bob Iger, and Rejection Proof. And Milena recommends Company of One, Why Staying Small is the Next Big Thing for Business by Paul Jarvis. So some other good recommendations there. I'm just going to, actually I can't paste them in the chat, unfortunately. Zoom won't let me. So I'm going to hopefully, if you're attending live, this will just get them into the Q&A panel, because I'm going to type an answer which will hopefully publish them there. So so lots of good ideas there. So fantastic. Well, Sarah, we could carry on chatting about this for hours, I think. But however, we're just about to reach the sort of the finishing time for the webinar. So just before we close, if there was one closing thought or one takeaway or one thing that you'd want people to take away from this webinar, what would it be?
I would say don't hesitate. Just do it. Just do it. If you think you're going to get something out of it, and then just do it. I found it such a valuable thing to do. In terms of effort to output, it's been little effort with a great benefit to me personally, and so I would recommend that you do it.
Absolutely.
That would be my
Absolutely. And in fact, I think again, this is bringing back lots of memories of books we read. Didn't we read a book by Richard Branson called "Screw It, Let's Do It" or something similar? So maybe that's a
Yes.
sort of thing.
Mantra, screw it, let's do it. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So fantastic. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for taking time out to have this conversation. I think that so many people will take away ideas from this, and hopefully, who knows how many book clubs will have been born today. We will hopefully find out. So thank you very much for taking the time. If people want to stay in touch with you, Sarah, as I'm sure they might do, how is the best way? Can people connect with you on LinkedIn or?
Yeah, connect with me on LinkedIn. That's fine. Yeah, do that. I'm on LinkedIn, so just search me. There aren't that many Sara Heavens.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And if you are attending live, thank you very much for attending. If you liked this session and want to view the recording will be edited and available by tomorrow morning UK time at the latest, probably later tonight, depending on how long the rendering takes. I have a couple of other upcoming webinars, which I would be really, really grateful if you signed up for or took a look at. I'm sure you'll find them interesting. I'm going to pop the links to them in the chat now. So the first one is Small Talk, Big Value, Building Great Working Relationships in a Virtual World with Christy Dean. So in the virtual sort of COVID world we live in at the moment, building relationships is quite a key skill for us to have. So do take a look at that one. And that's on the 18th of August. Also, the following day, on the 19th of August, I have one of Adrian's crazy ideas, which I'm experimenting with, it's a 1 hour mini event called the BA Fringe. And that's going to be like a webinar, only different. And I don't want to tell you too much about it because I don't want to spoil the surprise. But if you imagine sort of like a mixture of Richard and Judy, if you remember Richard and Judy, and backstage at Glastonbury with various guests talking about different things in more of a sort of TV style. Imagine like a 1 hour BA TV show. That's the vision. So take a look at that and do register. If you're attending live also, I'd be really, really grateful of your feedback. You will get an email with these links on as well, but I'll just paste a link to the feedback form in there as well. One of the questions, there's only like 3 questions on there. One of the questions is, are there topics that you would like me to cover? If there are, please say, because I'll try and find a speaker that will cover them. Even better is when people say, actually, I could speak about that, because this is absolutely something we can make happen. So fantastic. Well, thanks again, Sarah, for a really excellent, thought-provoking session. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and hope to see you all again soon. Bye for now.